Until a couple of years ago, aromatase was an obscure enzyme known only to biochemists and some medical doctors. However, because of what it does, it's become pretty well known in bodybuilding. What is aromatase? Aromatase is an enzyme that converts androgens such as testosterone, androstenedione, and others into estrogen. There's been a lot of interest in aromatase because one of the side effects of using, let's say, anabolic steroids, a lot of them can actually convert into estrogen through the actions of aromatase. So to combat this, a lot of bodybuilders and athletes who use larger doses of anabolic steroids also use drugs known as aromatase inhibitors. There's actually two choices of drugs to use to control aromatase. One of them is the aromatase inhibitors, and there's been several generations. I believe there's been 3 generations of aromatase inhibiting drugs. Their actual use in medicine is to treat postmenopausal breast cancer that is estrogen sensitive. However, they're also very powerful inhibitors of aromatase, and by inhibiting aromatase, you considerably reduce the amount of estrogen produced in the body. The other type of estrogen control drug is basically a blocking drug, such as tamoxifen citrate, also known as Navadex. That drug works by actually having a structure similar to estrogen, and it's so similar that it can actually occupy estrogen receptors. And when it does that, it blocks the interaction of estrogen with estrogen receptors. If estrogen cannot act with its cellular receptors or interact with its cellular receptors, it doesn't exert any biological effects. These days, the most common use, as I said, of aromatase inhibiting drugs or tamoxifen is to control estrogen and prevent anabolic steroid related side effects such as excessive water retention and most prominently gynecomastia, which is a excessive formation of glandular tissue in male breasts. It can grow to the extent where it almost looks like small teenage female teenage breasts in some men. You see it a lot in obese men too, because obese men tend to produce more estrogen because having more body fat also increases the activity of aromatase in the body. In other words, more body fat means more aromatase. So you see in a lot of obese men. Gynecomastia also shows up in certain periods of development. It shows up in older men as the testosterone levels go down and estradiol or estrogen levels increase. A lot of older men tend to get gynecomastia. I'm not going to talk a lot about gynecomastia. I'm already getting off track here, but I will say that a lot of men who are over 40 use drugs called statins. A little known fact about statins is they can also cause gynecomastia, as can many other drugs. But let's get back to the aromatase inhibitors. So these drugs are used to control estrogen. They're favored by bodybuilders and athletes, again, who use large amounts of anabolic steroids. A frequent question that I get, however, well, let me backtrack. Is there a possible danger of using these aromatase inhibitors? I'm going to talk about aromatase inhibitors rather than Navadex or estrogen receptor blockers today. So I just mentioned that in passing. Is there a danger involved with aromatase inhibiting drugs? Yes, there is. Some of these drugs are very powerful. For example, one called Arimidex, a generic name of anastrozole. It can actually lower estrogen levels 85 to 95% with a 1 milligram dosage. And what happens, extended use of this will basically produce a estrogen deficiency in men. The optimal levels of estrogen in men are between 20 and 30. If you get below 20, you could start to have estrogen problems, especially if you use these drugs for extended times. That can include bone loss and adverse changes in lipids, such as a lowering of high-density lipoprotein cholesterol, which protects against cardiovascular disease. There's also mental problems involved with low estrogen, and there's also problems with building muscle, because as I've said and written in my Applied Metabolics newsletter, a little known fact about estrogen is that there's 2 estrogen receptors. The estrogen receptor B, when you stimulate that, you also cause a promotion of satellite cell activity in muscle. Satellite cells are muscle stem cells involved in muscle repair and growth. So the bottom line is that cutting estrogen too low will adversely affect muscle growth, and also lowers levels of a anabolic hormone called insulin-like growth factor 1, or IGF-1. So those are the reasons why you want to be careful about lowering estrogen. But getting back to the drugs, a frequent question well, let me talk about estrogen blocking supplements. I'm going to look at one in particular. There was one on the market a couple of years ago called 6-oxo. That's a shortening of its actual name, which I won't even attempt to talk about or mention. But it was known as 6-oxo. It was produced by a man named Patrick Arnold, who was also famous for introducing androstenedione, a prohormone, to the market. 6-oxo, the chemical name was androstenedione, not dione, it's androstenedione. The studies that were conducted on it, human studies, showed that it actually was very effective at increasing testosterone. The suggested dosage was 300 to 600 milligrams. You weren't supposed to stay on it more than 8 weeks because of the estrogen suppression effect. As I said, can have adverse effects on health. A 300 milligram dose, if I remember correctly, could raise free testosterone or active testosterone. I believe it was 90%, and a 600 milligram dosage. A 300 milligram dose raised free testosterone 94%, and a 600 milligram dosage paradoxically raised it 86%. In other words, a larger dosage led to less testosterone increase. Why this happened, I don't think was ever explained. 6-oxo really did raise testosterone. The problem was that in the studies that looked at its effects in humans, it didn't really affect body composition. There was no real muscle gains from it. There's a lot of theories why. One theory that was rather interesting was that it might have what they call a competitive inhibition at the level of the androgen receptor. In other words, 6-oxo, to put it in simple terms, tended to block testosterone interacting with the androgen receptor, which would completely negate any anabolic effects of both 6-oxo and testosterone. One Canadian report, the Canadian Health Agency issued a report based on a single case study. A man who took 6-oxo supplements developed blood clots and seizures. So they issued a warning letter warning consumers not to ingest 6-oxo. 6-oxo was taken off the market. I'm not sure reasons why. Probably because it actually did raise testosterone, even though the raising of testosterone didn't seem to translate into any real anabolic effect. Anecdotally, when 6-oxo was available on the market, I actually recommended it to a couple of people that asked me about natural testosterone boosters. I said, try this stuff, 6-oxo, because some studies show that it really does raise testosterone. About 3 or 4 of these guys came back to me and told me they had to get off 6-oxo. And I asked them what happened. They told me that it completely reduced their sex drive to nothing. And 1 or 2 of them also claimed to get impotence from it. I have no explanation for that other than what I said earlier, possibly a competitive inhibition of 6-oxo versus testosterone at the level of the androgen receptor, but I have no evidence to prove that. I can only tell you that about 4 or 5 guys who I suggested 6-oxo to had very bad results from a sexual point of view. So anyway, it's a moot point because 6-oxo, to my knowledge, is not sold anymore. But that was one suggested estrogen blocker supplement that really did work. It really did inhibit aromatase quite a bit. There's a bunch of current supplements that also claim to do the same. I don't really know how effective they are. Some of them might work a little bit. None of them equal the effects of various anti-aromatase drugs. For example, formastane, arimidex, then a couple of other ones. These supplements don't even come close to the potency of the drugs. However, I ran across a kind of interesting study here. I should mention a couple of years ago, even before 6-oxo, almost forgot, there was a supplement introduced, I think it was in the late 90s. It was originally mentioned by a guy named Dan Duchesne in a publication called Muscle Media 2000. He called it Substance X, I believe. and it turned out that that was chrysin, it was called. Chrysin is a natural flavonoid. It's found in bee pollen and propolis, and it's also found in a plant called the passion flower. The reason why Duchenne was touting it was he was calling it a tremendous testosterone booster because it significantly lowered estrogen. Now, what Duchenne was basing this on was a study that was published in an obscure medical journal that compared the aromatase inhibiting effects of chrysin to a drug called aminoglutamide. Tough pronunciation. I'm going to call it by its trade name, Cytodrim. This study compared chrysin to Cytodrim and found that chrysin was just as potent as an Cytodrim, which was an established drug blocker of aromatase. Based on that, Duchenne leaped to the conclusion that Cytodrim would be an effective testosterone booster because it so effectively lowered estrogen. But subsequent studies showed that, you have to understand the study that showed this was what they call a isolated cell or in vitro study. It was not an actual human study. It was just an isolated cell study. When it was actually tested in humans, chrysin I'm talking about, it turns out that it was very poorly absorbed, less than 1% absorption bioavailability. In other words, most of it just passed right through you. Now, on the other hand, when it was injected directly into animal testicles, it actually did raise testosterone, and the mechanism was that it increased the activity of a protein called STAR. That's an acronym, STAR. What STAR does is it increases the transport of cholesterol into the testes, where the cholesterol is converted in a series of enzymatic steps into testosterone. So if you increase the activity of STAR, you're going to increase the transport of cholesterol and you're going to boost testosterone. However, this animal study showed that chrysin was only worked when it was injected directly into the testicles, which I don't think would have been very popular with humans. Does this mean chrysin is absolutely worthless? No. There's some initial studies show that for some reason it seems to have a preventative effect against colon cancer, and also other studies show, I'm not sure why, considering its low absorption rate, it seems to have an anti-anxiety effect. So, but as far as raising testosterone, chrysin, forget it. I did come across one obscure study where chrysin was combined with it might have been DMSO, I don't remember, but it was made into a topical form. When it was absorbed through the skin, chrysin actually did raise testosterone, but I don't think any commercial product, topical product of chrysin was ever introduced. So again, we could write off chrysin. However, I came across a study that was in a journal called Drug Analysis. It was called Drug Testing Analysis. It's a in-press study. It hasn't actually been published yet, but I found it interesting because they looked at a couple of what they call flavonoids. These are natural substances found in stuff like fruits and vegetables. And there have been a couple of flavonoids. Chrysin is a flavonoid, but there's a couple of others that have actually shown to be pretty potent aromatase inhibitors. Again, most of these were isolated cell studies. For example, there's one called quercetin, which is found in onions and other foods. Quercetin is, again, in these isolated cell studies, quercetin is comparable to drugs as far as inhibiting aromatase. There's another one called diadesin. Diadesin is found in soy. It's an isoflavone found in soy, also a pretty potent aromatase inhibitor. Now, what they did in this particular study was they looked at two synthetic flavonoids. The synthetic flavonoids they looked at were methoxyisoflavone. I don't want to mispronounce that. I'm going to call it methoxyisoflavone. Let's call it methisoflavone just to make it simple. This is a synthetic flavonoid that was developed by a Hungarian company in the 70s who got a patent on it where nobody could actually use it until the patent expired in 1979. And then somebody found supposedly found some work where it was given to cattle, and it significantly increased the muscle mass of the cattle. Based on this, they started selling it as a food supplement aimed at bodybuilders and other people, athletes who wanted to put on muscle. And unfortunately, it didn't really work. Once a 2001 study of it found that a dose of 800 milligrams ingested for 8 weeks did increase muscle mass in humans, but this was not an actual study. It was a kind of an abstract, part of a supplemental journal. There were several other studies that looked at methyl oxy and tested it for anabolic effects and found none, absolutely none. So why am I talking about it now? You'll see in a minute. There's another synthetic flavonoid called ipraflavone. Ipraflavone was also touted as an anabolic, a natural anabolic years ago. Ipraflavone was also initially thought to be a very effective bone builder, and a couple of early medical studies suggested that it can actually help prevent osteoporosis, which is a thinning of the bones, common in women with age, and men who are low in testosterone also get osteoporosis. However, when it was tested in human studies later on, ipraflavone unfortunately proved ineffective for protecting bones. It didn't work. However, why am I talking about this stuff? I'll tell you what. Because this new study looked at methoxyisoflavone and ipraflavone, and they compared it to 3 actual known drug aromatase inhibitors. The 3 drugs it was compared to were a drug called formastane, which has a trade name of Lenteron. This was an injectable aromatase inhibitor. It was called second generation because the first generation I'll get to in a second, but this was a second generation aromatase inhibitor that really did work. It was a drug, injected. Never caught on with bodybuilders or athletes, probably because it had to be injected. And it wasn't very good anyway because it only blocked 58% of aromatase activity. It wasn't a very good aromatase blocker anyway. So that was the first drug. The second drug used in the study was Cytodrin, aminoglutathamide. Cytodrin was a very popular drug back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s with bodybuilders. They used it as a estrogen blocker, and it actually, a 250 milligram dosage of Cytodrin could block estrogen production by 90%. Now that sounds pretty good. However, Cytodrin was not an exclusive aromatase blocker. What it did is it actually blocked an enzyme that was crucial in the production of all steroids in the body. In fact, in medicine, the indication for Cytodrin was to treat a disease called Cushing's disease, characterized by an excess of cortisol. When you gave patients with Cushing's disease Cytodrin, it lowered their cortisol levels. Now, a lot of bodybuilders, rather than take the small dosage that would knock out estrogen, I'm talking about Cytodrin, we're talking about 250 milligrams or even less, would effectively lower estrogen. They were told that taking larger amounts would also decrease water retention. So a lot of them took as many as 4 tablets, 1,000 milligrams a day, 3 to 4 tablets, 750 to 1,000 milligrams of Cytodrin, and they got some severe side effects because they knocked out cortisol. And what happens is their joints got so sore that they literally couldn't move, they couldn't even flex, and they were so weak and fatigued, they couldn't even get out of bed practically. So this was a powerful drug, kind of overkill, I'd say, for controlling estrogen, because you have to understand, it knocks out all steroid synthesis. When you take Cytodrin, you're not only knocking out estrogen, you're also knocking out testosterone. So if you're not on anabolic steroids and you take Cytodrin, it will actually lower your testosterone levels. Very dumb drug to take to lower estrogen. The third generation aromatase inhibitors is represented by, for example, Arimidex or anastrozole. That is a whole different ballgame. That exclusively works only on the aromatase enzyme, lowers it anywhere from 85% to 92%. And those are the 3 drugs that were compared to methoxyisoflavone and ipraflavone, were compared to formastane, Cytodrin, and Arimidex. What did the study show? This, again, isolated study, be careful. The study showed that these two synthetic isoflavonoids, I'm sorry, these two synthetic flavonoids were actually just as potent at inhibiting aromatase as these very potent actual drugs. So on an isolated cell basis, these natural substances are just as potent as actual drugs. Does it work like that in the body? Very doubtful. Why? Because just like chrism, all of these flavonoids have a very low, poor bioavailability. In other words, they're not absorbed very well. If there was a way to increase the absorption, then you would have an effect of being able to control aromatase and consequently estrogen with virtually no side effects whatsoever other than the low estrogen itself that would result. I should also point out that there's a lot of natural aromatase inhibitors in common foods. For example, you might not know coffee. Coffee is a natural aromatase inhibitor. How much coffee you'd have to drink to do that is scary to think about. Probably on the toxic level where you would stop your heart. Tea also is an aromatase inhibitor. Cigarette smoke is an aromatase inhibitor. A particularly good one is grapeseed extract. Grapeseed extract might actually slightly lower aromatase, not to the extent of drugs like Arimidex, but it'll lower it slightly. So, if you're concerned about slightly elevated estrogen, grapeseed extract might actually help. I'd say a dosage of 300 to 600 milligrams a day. It might help because it's absorbed a little bit better than the flavonoids. Cruciferous vegetables, broccoli, vegetables, kale, they lower aromatase. There's a certain type of mushroom called white button mushrooms. They lower aromatase. So, again, how much of this stuff you'd have to eat to actually lower it, I don't know, but I do know that eating cruciferous vegetables, because of other compounds in the vegetables, effectively does control estrogen because it converts active 16-hydroxyestrogens into, 2-hydroxyestrogens into the 16 form. The 16 form is inactive biochemically, so it turns active estrogens into inactive estrogens. Because of this, consuming cruciferous vegetables, again, broccoli, kale, cabbage, that kind of stuff, can not only help prevent female-related, estrogen-related cancers in females, such as breast and endometrial cancer, but it also will help prevent prostate cancer in men. So the healthiest vegetables you could possibly eat are cruciferous vegetables. Keep that in mind. You should have them at least every other day, I even have them every day. I can't stand the taste. I mix it in a special type of blender mixed with an apple. Tastes terrible, but I drink it right down. I do this because the health protection effects of compounds like sulforaphane found in broccoli are so extensive that I cannot afford not to ingest this stuff. I will mention one other study. This was a study published in 2014 in an obscure medical journal. It was called Co-Administrating Luteolin Minimizes the Side Effects of the Aromatase Inhibitor Letrozole. Letrozole, again, is a potent drug aromatase inhibitor. And this study showed that, again, isolated cell study, it showed that this natural substance, luteolin, was just as potent as letrozole in lowering the activity of aromatase. Luteolin, by the way, in case you're wondering, it's found in natural vegetables such as celery, broccoli, carrots, thyme, and green peppers. And interesting enough, an interesting aspect of this study was that when letrozole had a number of side effects, including a lowering of protective high-density lipoprotein and numerous other side effects. Yet the luteolin had the just as potent effect at lowering aromatase as the drug, yet produced zero side effects, no side effects whatsoever. So that's about it for this video. I mean, interesting stuff. I mean, if we could figure out a way to get these compounds, these natural substances absorbed, you'd have a hell of a great estrogen control situation there. I mean, and I'm talking about natural with zero side effects. The only thing you have to be concerned about is you don't want your estrogen to go too low, because again, that could cause health problems. If you want further information about nutrition, including natural ways to control estrogen, because I'm sure there'll be a lot more in the future, supplements, exercise science, hormonal therapy, fat loss techniques that work, anti-aging research, ergogenic aids, women's health. Subscribe today to my Applied Metabolics newsletter, www.appliedmetabolics.com. 40 to 50 pages every month. It's more like a monthly ebook than a newsletter. I shouldn't have called it a newsletter. No ads, just pure information written in simple English. I have over 4 decades of professional writing experience. I know how to communicate. I guarantee you, anybody who's not illiterate will understand what I write. Anybody who has about a 4th grade education will understand what I write. Unlike a lot of other digital publications that are written in techno-speak, which are you have to open a medical dictionary to read. You won't need that with my newsletter because I explain everything in simple English. It's very practical, and I write about stuff that you can use today, not theoretical stuff that's usable today. And I try to avoid rat and animal studies because they're not always applicable to humans. So again, www.appliedmetabolics.com. When you subscribe, I will send you an invitation to join my private Applied Metabolics Facebook page, where I post news about medicine, nutrition, and exercise nearly every day. And I also answer questions. Speaking of questions, as a subscriber, you could submit short questions to me through the Applied Metabolics email portal, and I will be happy to answer that, but that's only for subscribers. I don't answer unsolicited questions. So subscribe today. You won't be sorry. I promise you, I guarantee you, you will learn something in every issue, no matter, I don't care what your level of education is. You can have 10 PhDs and you'll still learn something in every issue. I guarantee that. And I don't cover the same garbage that's on all these websites and blogs. My stuff is kind of off the road. In other words, it's stuff that's practical, but it's not, you don't see it on a lot of blogs and websites. They write the same stuff over and over again. I don't do that. So that's about it. And again, if you want to have the best friend you ever have, go to your local shelter, adopt a dog. Take care.